So now we're going to talk about kiln atmosphere. So kiln atmosphere refers to what's going on inside the kiln when you're firing it, particularly towards the end of the firing or as the kiln cools down. Kiln atmosphere is how much fuel and how much air you have in the kiln, essentially. And this can impact what the clay body looks like, what the ceramics itself looks like without glaze. It also impacts certain glaze chemicals, creating really different effects if it's oxidation and reduction. And it's really important to understand that kiln atmosphere is not directly related to temperature. You can have an oxidation firing that's high temperature or low temperature. You can have a reduction firing that's high temperature or low temperature. Because we often fire a neutral bisque and a reduction glaze, sometimes that gets confusing, but atmosphere is just separate from what the temperature is. So first we'll talk about reduction. So reduction firings means in the kiln you have plenty of fuel and you don't have very much air. That fuel can be wood, it can be gas, it can be natural gas or propane. We can also make a reduction atmosphere inside in a pit kiln or bonfire kiln or garbage can kiln where you have a lot of fuel wrapped up tight around the work, but you don't allow it very much air. We've talked about that a little bit previously, where you might have a pit firing that you block off the sides with broken ceramic pieces or with pieces of metal or something so the breeze can't get through. We'll also talk about saggers, which are essentially boxes inside the kiln that can control the atmosphere, separate from the rest of the kiln. So when we fire a reduction kiln, it's going to impact our clays differently. Our stoneware is going to have kind of a speckly effect. There are other kinds of stonewares where the clay itself will get very dark. The stoneware we currently use in the Dakota white stoneware just gets kind of a speckly effect. And this comes from the iron in the clay. The porcelain, which doesn't have those kind of impurities, those iron bits in it, will turn a really pure white. And it actually is sort of a harder, purer white than you get in a oxidation or neutral atmosphere. And then importantly, coppers turn red. So I'm going to show you some examples of this. First of all, I want to mention when we're firing, we can check, we can control and look at the atmosphere. So here's a picture of Les, one of our studio helpers, peeking inside the kiln. He's actually checking the cones. The way we check the atmosphere is a little bit different. But before, we had things like oxyprobes that would tell us exactly what the oxygen was in the kiln. People would actually look at the color of the color of the flame coming out of the chimney or out of the spy hole here to gauge the atmosphere inside. Like I said, we get reds, like the reds you see up at the top here. We get purples, which are essentially the copper is what causes the red in some of the glazes, and then the purples come from a mix of red and of copper and cobalt to create that purple. The clay also changes color. I should mention all the pictures in here are either student work or my work from various times. So here in this one, this was fired in a reduction atmosphere, but didn't have any glaze on it. And it just happened to be one of the few examples I had at home. But you can see how kind of speckly and dark that clay body has gotten. Whereas here's what that clay body looked like when it came out of the bisque. The clay or the glazes can turn purple, and here actually we have two examples of glazes with copper in them. This one was fired in a reduction kiln. I don't think it was a pure copper glaze. It also had some cobalt in it, I think. And you can see how it gets very, very red. We've also got some places where for some reason it was either thinner or there was less reduction in that part of the kiln. And so you have some variation. And then over here, I think this is a raku fired piece. Might have been just a oxidation fired piece. But the kiln it was fired in a more oxidation atmosphere, so that copper turned green. Here we have a direct comparison. Same glaze, turns red, turns green or kind of clear in a reduction kiln with the red, in an oxidation kiln with the green. Saggers I mentioned, excluding, excuse me. Saggers I mentioned, these are essentially boxes that you put stuff in. So these are ceramic boxes just from my home studio. They can be a lot bigger, fancier, etc. But these pieces here were fired in a sagger in my kiln because the clay itself, it's this Martianware from Seattle Pottery. It has some salt in it, and I wasn't sure if it would damage the kiln. So I kept the atmosphere of that salty clay inside the sagger box. Now, you can also fire, make the inside of a sagger, you can make the inside of it oxidation in a kiln that is otherwise got a lot of ash flying through it, so that inside of the box it's not oxidation, but it doesn't get that stuff on it. You can also have the inside of the box, you can add fuel into there and essentially create a self-contained pit firing, more or less, that has the atmosphere, that extra reduction material, that extra fuel inside of it. So you could fire, say, an electric kiln, but inside of it you had the reduction atmosphere. So oxidation is another type of firing, and this is fired potentially in the same kiln. So at YVC we fire an oxidation firing in the gas kiln. This is the gas kiln from the back, where you can see the the blue is the air, or the kind of teal is the air vents. The yellow is the gas line. So we have natural gas that we're controlling how much goes in. We have air that we control how much goes in. You see the dials here and here. And of course I've taken this picture while it's firing, so you can see it's going in the bottom of that kiln. Oops. Where did that go? Here we have the chimney. And so the opening for the chimney is back over here. This is a damper, so we can close up. So in an oxidation atmosphere, not only do we put in more air than fuel, we also will open up things like the damper or the spy holes, or vents, or whatever openings the kiln has in it, depending on the structure of the kiln, so that it can get more air in. And so with more air, that oxygen creates a different atmosphere. And let me sneak back here to this one and talk about what's actually, to this one, and talk about what's actually happening. In a reduction atmosphere, because the fire is burning and it doesn't have enough oxygen, it's actually pulling oxygen out of whatever chemicals are available. So our clay has iron oxide in it. Iron, when you pull the oxide out, when you pull the oxygen out, the iron shows up like more metallic iron would look. With the glaze, we've got copper oxide or copper carbonate, and when the kiln goes looking for the oxygen in that chemical, the chemical itself reacts differently. In an oxidation atmosphere, there is plenty of oxygen, and so the fire doesn't need to go looking for the oxides in the clay materials. Here we have an example of the porcelain clay in an oxidation firing, and then the glaze, of course, is in the oxidation firing as well. Our purple glazes tend to turn kind of a blue in an oxidation firing. This is just a picture of the work before it was fired. And then both of our clays stay fairly white. Some of the other colors are a little bit impacted as well, the glaze colors. I just don't have a ton of pictures at home where I'm making this. Our third type of atmosphere is, often people just talk about oxidation and reduction, but technically an electric kiln is a neutral atmosphere. So technically there's plenty of oxygen, you're not putting in too much, you're not adding fuel, so it's getting heated with electricity. And this kind of atmosphere is what we see for a bisque firing. It's also, we can also control it intentionally in something like a gas kiln, right? Put in just a perfect mix of fuel. So we in the YVC studio use electric kilns sometimes to do what we call oxidation firings, because the glazes act a lot like they would in an actual oxidation firing. And we also do sometimes low fire glaze firings. And so this piece here is a low fire glaze. So these are under glazes with a low fire clear over the top. The green might be a glaze that we have too. And then these, you can see that the clay at the bottom is the same color as you would see in a bisque firing, because the temperature is, sometimes we fire these at that same temperature. And these are fired at that low temperature. Here's like another couple of examples of pieces fired at a low temperature in an oxidation firing. And so you can see we have these bright underglazes that we tend to use. Those underglazes don't always hang out. They don't always show up at the higher temperatures. And the last kind of category of firings or atmospheres I want to talk about are technically more reduction, but a little bit different. So in a raku firing, this is a type of firing where we take work out of the kiln when it is, so I should say too, raku, Western raku is totally different than Japanese raku. So it comes from Japanese raku, but we messed it up, changed a bunch of things when we moved it to Europe and to the US or Americas. So anyway, what we call raku, what is technically Western raku, this is a type of firing that we take the work out of the kiln. So this is a propane fired kiln. You can see the propane burner. This is actually a Venturi burner, which means we don't have a blower. We just, the burner itself is designed to pull air in. And so we can control how much air and how much fuel is going into this firing. So we can do a reduction firing during the firing. But the thing that's exciting about raku is you take the work out when it's red hot. So see the inside of this pot that he's picking up that looks kind of red? That it's red because it's that hot. It's about 1800 degrees as he picks it up with those tongs and takes it out. He's going to then put it in a bucket of combustibles, so shredded paper or leaves, sawdust if we can get it without chemicals, and that stuff will start on fire. We'll close up the lid of that bucket. So you can see these folks, Betty and Janice, they've put work in here, and then Janice is about to put leaves on it, Betty is about to put shredded paper on something. Then we'll put the lid on that bucket. It'll start burning right away, and that is a post-reduction, a post-firing, after the firing reduction. And so it's reducing, it's got lots of fuel, not very much air because we put the lid on tight. And that will actually cause the raku, the clay, the glazes are impacted and the clay is impacted. And so here at the bottom of this piece, actually, you know what? That's a different glaze. I'll show you another one. These 4 pieces all have a couple of different types of copper glazes on them, and these are fired to a lower temperature than those other coppers. They're also fired in a kiln that can be controlled how much reduction or oxidation we have. So when you see the reddish, shiny red, and the kind of copper metal color, those were fired in a reduction atmosphere. The blues and the teals, like we start to get here, or the bright greens that we start to get up here, may be less, more of an oxidation atmosphere. But these things can also be affected by being put into the post-reduction firing, or post-firing reduction, excuse me. Here we've got a couple of examples where we can really clearly see the smoke. So when we put the pieces into that bucket, the paper burns and any exposed clay. So this student used resist to keep the glaze from going in all the places that are black. And what the black is actually the smoke that's sucked in to the clay. The clay absorbed that smoke during the firing. Over here, the glaze is actually cracked. It's designed to do that. It's technically a glaze fault, but we design it that way. And then the cracks are where the smoke has gone through the crack in the glaze and been absorbed into the clay itself. Now, these are fired at a lower temperature so they can still absorb that smoke from the firing. When we talked before about pit fires or smoke fires or bonfires, it's the same sort of thing is happening. So these pieces all came out of a pit firing, these ones on the bottom, and this one over here. They were fired to a low temperature. They had plenty of fuel all around them, so they sucked up that smoke. This one had an area that had some air, and so it didn't suck up as much smoke. And then this one over here is actually a horsehair raku, which is a type of raku where you just take it out of the kiln when it's hot, got no glaze on it, and then you put little pieces of horsehair, hair from a horse, on it. The horsehair burns, and the pot sucks up that smoke from those little pieces of horsehair, and so you get that nice effect. This one is a burnished piece, and that shine just comes from the smooth clay. The color comes from the smoke.